Sometimes the biggest mistake a man can make is believing the room belongs to him. The courtroom in downtown Birmingham carried that quiet, suffocating stillness that always settled in just before a judge walked in. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting pale reflections across polished wooden benches worn smooth by decades of trials, arguments, and verdicts that had changed lives forever. The seal of justice hung high above the bench, a reminder of the law that was supposed to stand taller than pride, anger, or prejudice. People shifted in their seats, lawyers whispered to clients, and the slow ticking of the wall clock measured the tension building in the room second by second. At the center of it all stood a man most people had already decided didn't belong there. Darius Cole, 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that looked simple but fit him with quiet precision. His posture was straight, his movements controlled, the kind of stillness you only see in someone who has spent years learning how to keep calm in places far more dangerous than a courtroom. To most of the people watching, though, none of that mattered. What they saw first was a black man standing inside a space where authority usually looked very different. And in that room, perception had a way of becoming judgment before a single word was spoken. Darius had arrived that morning to support his younger sister Tanya, who sat quietly at the defense table clutching a folder of legal documents with both hands. She kept her eyes down, trying not to notice the glances from the gallery, the murmurs floating across the benches, or the way tension seemed to follow her brother like a shadow. Darius had told her everything would be fine. His voice had been calm, steady, the kind of reassurance that didn't rely on volume but on certainty. What he hadn't expected was how quickly the atmosphere would shift the moment he stepped closer to the center of the courtroom. Officer Brett Lawson had been standing near the aisle, arms crossed, badge catching the harsh overhead light every time he moved. Lawson had been with the department for almost 15 years, long enough to believe he could read a situation in seconds, long enough to trust his instincts more than the facts. When his eyes landed on Darius, something in his expression tightened. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just a slight narrowing of the eyes, the kind of look that quietly decides someone is a problem before they've done anything at all. Lawson stepped forward with the slow confidence of someone used to controlling the room. His boots tapped against the tile floor with sharp echoes that pulled a few curious glances from the gallery. "You can't stand there," he said, his voice low but firm. Darius turned toward him calmly. "I'm here with my sister," he replied, nodding toward the defense table. His tone wasn't confrontational. If anything, it carried a kind of disciplined patience, the kind that suggested he had spent years learning how to handle situations that could spiral out of control in seconds. But Lawson didn't hear patience. What he heard was resistance. A murmur rolled softly across the room as Lawson stepped even closer, placing a hand against Darius's shoulder in a gesture that felt less like guidance and more like a challenge. The contact lasted only a moment before Darius instinctively shifted back half a step, removing the hand without raising his voice. It was a small movement, controlled, respectful, but in Lawson's mind, it crossed a line. The officer's expression hardened instantly, the air in the courtroom tightening as if everyone could feel the tension snap into place. Before anyone fully understood what was happening, Lawson reacted with a sudden movement that caused several people in the gallery to gasp. Chairs creaked. Papers rustled. The quiet rhythm of the courtroom shattered. Darius staggered back one step from the unexpected contact, catching his balance almost immediately. For a brief second, the entire room froze. Lawyers stopped whispering. A clerk looked up from her laptop. Even the clock on the wall seemed louder now, each tick echoing through the stunned silence. And then something even stranger happened. Darius didn't react with anger. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward or try to escalate the moment. Instead, he slowly straightened his jacket, adjusted the sleeve of his suit, and looked directly at Officer Lawson with an expression so calm it made the tension in the room feel heavier. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and carried across the courtroom with a clarity that cut through the silence like a blade. "Officer," he said quietly, holding Lawson's gaze without blinking, "you just made the worst mistake of your career." The words hung in the air, heavier than anyone expected. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone near the back whispered something under their breath. Lawson scoffed. clearly convinced he still controlled the situation. But what no one in that courtroom realized in that moment was that the man standing in front of him wasn't just another face in a courtroom crowd. Darius Cole had spent 14 years serving in one of the most disciplined military units in the world. He had stood in deserts thousands of miles from home, navigated missions where a single decision could mean life or death, and learned the kind of composure most people never experience in an entire lifetime. And right now, standing under the cold lights of a county courthouse, that same discipline was the only thing keeping a far bigger storm from breaking loose inside that room. Because what Officer Lawson had just done, in front of witnesses, cameras, and the seal of justice hanging above the bench, had set something in motion that no badge, no reputation, and no assumption about who belonged where would be able to stop. The silence after his words felt heavier than the sound that had come before it. For a few seconds the entire courtroom seemed suspended in place, as if the air itself had paused to consider what had just happened. The faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights above became strangely noticeable, echoing softly against the tall ceilings of the old courthouse. Somewhere in the back row a chair creaked as someone shifted their weight, but no one spoke. Officer Brett Lawson let out a short laugh under his breath, the kind that carried more irritation than humor. He adjusted the collar of his uniform and glanced around the room, as if expecting agreement from the silent audience. To him the moment was already finished. Just another minor disruption handled by authority. Just another man who had stepped out of line and needed to be reminded where he stood. But the reaction he expected never came. Instead, the stillness deepened. Several people in the gallery exchanged uncertain looks. One of the court clerks, a woman who had worked in that courthouse for more than 20 years, stared at Darius Cole a little longer than the others. Something about his posture unsettled her. Not because he looked angry, but because he did not. Men who lost control usually raised their voices, moved too quickly, or tried to argue their way out of a confrontation. Darius did none of those things. He stood there with the quiet composure of someone who had already measured the situation and decided exactly how much energy it deserved. His shoulders remained square, his breathing steady. Even his eyes did not shift from Lawson. Across the room, Tanya Cole watched the scene unfold with growing worry. Her hands tightened around the folder resting on her lap. She knew her brother better than anyone else in that room. She had seen him return from deployments that lasted months, sometimes years, carrying stories he never fully shared and memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. But she had also seen the discipline that came with that life. The patience, the quiet strength that allowed him to remain calm even when the world around him expected a reaction. That calm was what frightened her now. Because when Darius became this quiet, it meant he was thinking several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Officer Lawson mistook the silence for submission. He stepped closer again, the faint scent of polished leather and department-issued cologne following him as he moved. His voice dropped slightly, but the sharp edge remained. He told Darius that the courtroom was not a place for unnecessary interference, and that if he wanted to remain inside the room, he would need to follow instructions without question. The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. Authority in that building had always relied on tone more than volume. Still, a few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The tension had begun to spread through the room like slow-moving fog. At the defense table, Tanya finally lifted her eyes toward her brother. For a moment, she looked ready to speak, but Darius gave the smallest shake of his head. It was almost invisible, the kind of signal only someone who knew him well would recognize. Stay calm. Let this play out. A faint murmur drifted across the benches as one of the junior attorneys leaned toward a colleague and whispered something too quiet to hear clearly. The clerk near the judge's bench glanced down at the digital docket on her screen, then back toward Darius again. Her brow furrowed slightly as she read the name displayed beside the case information. Darius Cole. Something about it tugged at her memory. The name felt familiar in a way she could not immediately place. Meanwhile, Lawson had already turned slightly away, convinced the situation had been resolved. He believed the message had been delivered and the order of the courtroom restored. But just as he began to step back toward his original position, a subtle change rippled through the room. It started with the clerk who had been staring at her screen. Her eyes moved from the name on the docket to the man standing calmly in the center of the courtroom, then back to the screen again. Her expression shifted, confusion slowly giving way to recognition. She leaned closer to the monitor, reading the line once more to make sure she had not misunderstood it. Across the room, Darius remained perfectly still, his gaze steady, his presence as controlled as ever. Yet something about the atmosphere had changed. It was small at first, almost invisible, but in a place where every detail carried weight. Even the smallest shift could alter the balance of an entire room. And at that moment, without Officer Lawson realizing it, the balance had already begun to move. The clerk stared at the name on the docket a second time, her eyes moving slowly across the letters, as if the arrangement might suddenly change if she blinked. Darius Cole. The name sat there in plain text beside the case number, yet something about it carried weight she could not immediately explain. She leaned closer to the screen, her fingers hovering above the keyboard without pressing a single key. In a courthouse where thousands of names pass through the system every year, familiarity usually meant nothing. But this one felt different. She looked up again toward the man standing calmly in the center of the courtroom. Darius had not moved since Officer Lawson stepped away. His posture remained composed, shoulders relaxed, his attention drifting briefly toward the tall windows along the side wall where faint daylight filtered through the glass. The light caught the edge of his suit sleeve and the small silver watch on his wrist, reflecting a quiet steadiness that contrasted sharply with the tension building around him. Most people in the room were still trying to process what had just happened. Some leaned toward each other, whispering quietly, careful not to draw attention. Others watched Darius with curiosity that bordered on disbelief. The courtroom had seen its share of heated moments over the years, but there was something unusual about the calm that followed this one. It did not feel like the end of an argument. It felt like the beginning of something none of them fully understood yet. At the defense table, Tanya Cole sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on her brother. She knew that expression on his face. It was the same expression he had worn years ago when he returned home after his first long deployment overseas. Calm, focused, patient in a way that suggested he was already measuring the outcome of events that had not happened yet. Tanya had grown up watching Darius carry responsibilities far heavier than most people their age ever faced. When their father passed away unexpectedly, it had been Darius who stepped forward to hold the family together. When opportunities for college faded because money ran short, it had been Darius who chose another path, one that required discipline most people could not imagine. The military had not changed who he was. It had simply sharpened the qualities he already possessed: commitment, restraint, and a deep understanding that respect was something earned through actions rather than demanded through authority. Across the room, Officer Lawson adjusted the radio clip to his uniform and glanced toward the gallery again. The murmurs had begun to fade, replaced by that same uneasy quiet that often returned to a courtroom once an interruption had passed. Lawson appeared satisfied with the way things had settled. From his perspective, the message had been clear. The room had been reminded who controlled the order of proceedings. What he did not notice was the clerk slowly standing from her chair near the bench. Her eyes were still fixed on the monitor for a moment longer before she looked toward Darius again. A memory had surfaced in the back of her mind, triggered by the name she had just read. It was not a personal memory. It was something she had seen months earlier in a briefing circulated through several government offices in the state. A notice about a decorated service member scheduled to assist in a legal matter connected to a federal review. The details had not been public, and most of the courthouse staff had skimmed the document without paying much attention. But the name had stayed with her because it had appeared beside a list of commendations that stretched far longer than most files she had ever seen. She glanced once more at the docket and quietly reached for a folder stacked beside her keyboard. Inside were the preliminary documents filed earlier that morning for the hearing. Her eyes scanned the first page until the same name appeared again: Darius Cole. The air in the courtroom still felt tense, but now the tension carried a different tone. It was no longer the uncertainty of a disruption. It was the slow realization that the man many had dismissed a few minutes earlier might not be who they assumed he was. Meanwhile, Darius remained exactly where he had been standing since the moment the room fell silent. His breathing remained steady, his attention calm, as if the shifting atmosphere around him was simply another detail to observe rather than react to. The discipline that had guided him through years of service had taught him something important about moments like this. Real power rarely needed to announce itself. Sometimes it only needed patience. And in that courthouse, Beneath the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the watchful eyes of strangers, patience was beginning to change everything. The tension in the courtroom no longer felt like a passing disturbance. It had settled into the room like a storm waiting just beyond the horizon. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights continued overhead, but now every small sound seemed amplified. The shuffle of papers, the soft tap of a pen against a legal pad, the distant echo of footsteps somewhere in the hallway outside the courtroom doors. Officer Brett Lawson did not notice the change right away. To him, the situation had already ended. He stood near the aisle again with the same confident posture he had carried into the room earlier, his arms loosely folded across his chest as he scanned the gallery with casual authority. Years of working inside the courthouse had trained him to expect compliance. Most people lowered their eyes, stepped aside, and avoided confrontation the moment a uniform appeared. That pattern had repeated itself so often that Lawson rarely questioned it anymore. From his perspective, the order of the room had been restored. Yet several people in the gallery had begun watching him differently. It was subtle, almost invisible, but the shift was there. A few minutes earlier, those same faces had carried curiosity or discomfort directed toward Darius Cole. Now their attention drifted back toward Lawson himself. Meanwhile, the clerk near the bench quietly closed the folder she had been examining. Her expression had changed from curiosity to something closer to concern. She glanced toward the hallway that led to the administrative offices, then back toward the man standing calmly near the center of the courtroom. Darius had not moved more than a few inches since the moment the room fell silent. He stood beside the defense table with the quiet patience of someone who had learned to wait through situations far more uncertain than this one. The years he had spent in disciplined service had taught him that control was not measured by who spoke the loudest or moved the fastest. Real control often came from the ability to remain steady while everything else shifted around you. Tanya watched him carefully from her seat. She could feel the change in the room even if she could not yet explain it. The whispers had stopped. The curious glances had faded. Instead, people seemed to be studying the scene with a growing awareness that something important had just unfolded. Darius leaned slightly toward the defense table and placed a reassuring hand on the back of Tanya's chair for a brief moment before stepping back again. The gesture was small, but it carried the quiet message he had always used when she felt uncertain growing up. Everything is under control. Across the room, Officer Lawson finally noticed the clerk standing near the bench. She appeared to be speaking quietly with another staff member who had just stepped through the side door that led to the internal offices of the courthouse. Their conversation lasted only a few seconds, but the second employee glanced toward Darius almost immediately after hearing the name. Lawson frowned slightly, his attention sharpening. He was accustomed to reading body language quickly. Something about the way those two employees looked toward the center of the room caught his attention. It was not fear. It was not confusion. It looked more like recognition. The officer shifted his stance and took a few steps closer again, his eyes narrowing as he studied Darius more carefully. For the first time since the confrontation, Lawson seemed to actually observe the man standing in front of him. The calm posture, the steady breathing, the expression that remained composed despite the tension surrounding them. It was the kind of composure Lawson had seen only a few times before, usually in people who had spent years in environments where panic could cost lives. The realization flickered briefly across his face before disappearing behind his usual confident expression. Still, the atmosphere had already changed. The clerk who had been studying the documents approached the bench and placed a single folder on the polished wood surface where the judge would soon sit. Her movements were careful, deliberate. She glanced toward Darius once more, then toward Lawson, and finally toward the courtroom doors, as if she were waiting for something that had not arrived yet. The clock on the wall ticked forward another minute. The quiet grew heavier, and slowly, without a single raised voice or dramatic gesture, the balance of power inside that courtroom continued to shift in a direction Officer Lawson had not anticipated. The quiet inside the courtroom had turned into something heavier than tension. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The fluorescent lights above continued their steady hum, but now every person sitting on those wooden benches seemed more aware of every passing second. Even the ticking wall clock sounded louder than it had a few minutes earlier. Officer Brett Lawson shifted his stance again, clearly sensing that the attention of the room had changed direction. He had spent years working security inside this courthouse, and experience had taught him how to recognize when a crowd was watching too closely. Usually that attention meant someone was about to challenge his authority. Yet the man standing across from him was doing nothing of the sort. Darius Cole remained calm, almost motionless, as if the weight of the moment did not belong to him at all. His hands rested loosely at his sides, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing slow and steady. It was the kind of stillness that only comes from discipline practiced over many years. To someone unfamiliar with that kind of composure, it could easily be mistaken for indifference. But to anyone who understood the habits of trained professionals, the quiet control carried a very different meaning. Tanya Cole felt that meaning immediately. Sitting at the defense table, she watched the subtle exchange of glances happening around the room. People were no longer whispering about the disruption from earlier. Instead, they were studying the situation with growing curiosity. A pair of attorneys seated along the left side of the gallery leaned toward one another, their voices barely audible as they exchanged a quick comment before returning their attention to Darius. Near the back row, an older man in a dark suit slowly removed his glasses and polished them with a handkerchief while watching the scene unfold with measured interest. The tension had transformed into something quieter but far more deliberate. Meanwhile, the clerk who had been reviewing the documents stepped away from the bench and quietly approached another courthouse employee standing near the side door. Their conversation lasted only a few seconds, but the reaction was immediate. The second employee looked toward Darius with raised eyebrows, then quickly turned back toward the hallway that led to the administrative offices. Officer Lawson noticed the exchange this time. His expression tightened as he followed their line of sight back toward Darius. For the first time since the confrontation began, Lawson seemed uncertain about the assumptions he had made earlier. He studied the man standing before him more carefully now. The suit, the posture, the quiet patience. None of it matched the picture Lawson had formed in his mind during those first few seconds. People who caused trouble usually argued, protested, or demanded attention. Darius had done none of those things. Instead, he had simply remained present, allowing the moment to unfold without resistance. Lawson cleared his throat and took another step forward, his voice controlled but slightly sharper than before as he addressed Darius again. He told him that the courtroom would begin proceedings shortly and that everyone present was expected to follow instructions without creating unnecessary disruptions. The words sounded official, practiced, the kind of statement repeated countless times in rooms like this. But the reaction he received was not the one he expected. Darius met the officer's gaze calmly. His eyes carried no anger and no challenge. Only a quiet certainty that seemed to unsettle the room more than any raised voice ever could. He nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the statement without adding a single unnecessary word. That brief movement seemed to echo through the room louder than any argument might have. A few people shifted in their seats again. The clerk returned to her, stationed behind the bench, but kept glancing toward the doorway that led deeper into the courthouse offices. It was clear now that something had already been set in motion beyond the walls of the courtroom. Lawson sensed it too, even if he could not yet see exactly what it was. The confident expression he had carried earlier had begun to fade slightly around the edges, because the room no longer felt like it belonged entirely to him. And as the minutes continued to pass under the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the watchful eyes of strangers, the quiet patience of the man standing across from him began to feel far more powerful than anyone had first imagined. The silence that settled over the courtroom was no longer ordinary tension. It had transformed into something deeper, something that made even the most routine movements feel unusually deliberate. The fluorescent lights overhead continued their quiet buzzing while the tall windows along the side walls allowed thin strips of afternoon sunlight to stretch across the polished floor. Dust particles drifted slowly through the beams of light, turning the still air into something almost visible. Officer Brett Lawson stood near the aisle with his jaw slightly tightened, his attention now fixed on Darius Cole in a way it had not been earlier. The officer had seen many people walk through this courtroom during his years on duty. Some arrived nervous. Some arrived angry. Others arrived desperate. But the man standing in front of him did not fit any of those patterns. Darius remained composed, the calm in his posture almost unsettling in its steadiness. He looked less like someone caught in an uncomfortable situation and more like someone observing a moment that had not yet fully revealed itself. Tanya Cole noticed the shift as well. Her eyes moved from the gallery to the clerk, then back to her brother. She had known Darius all her life, but even she could not always read what was happening behind that controlled expression of his. When they were children growing up in Birmingham, Darius had always been the quiet one in the family. Their father used to say that some people learn to talk their way through problems, while others learn to listen long enough to understand them. Darius had always belonged to the second group. Years later, that same habit had followed him into the military, where patience and discipline were often the difference between chaos and control. Across the room, the courthouse clerk continued glancing toward the side hallway where administrative staff often moved between offices. The document she had read minutes earlier still rested in her memory like a puzzle piece waiting to be placed in the right position. Darius Cole, decorated service member. Federal clearance noted in the original notice. The words replayed quietly in her mind as she compared them with the man now standing calmly beside the defense table. She could not see the full story yet, but she knew enough to recognize that the situation unfolding in the courtroom might carry more significance than most people realized. A second courthouse employee stepped quietly through the side door and approached the clerk with a cautious expression. They exchanged a few hushed words before both of them looked toward Darius again. Their conversation lasted only seconds, yet the reaction was immediate. The second employee nodded once and turned back toward the hallway, as if preparing to notify someone further inside the building. Officer Lawson noticed that movement immediately. His eyes followed the employee until the door closed again, leaving the room wrapped in its uneasy quiet once more. Lawson shifted his weight slightly, the polished leather of his duty belt creaking as he moved. Something about the situation now felt different from the quick confrontation he believed he had already resolved. The officer studied Darius again with renewed attention. This time he did not see a random visitor or a concerned family member. He saw a man whose composure had not cracked even under pressure. A man whose presence seemed to quietly reshape the atmosphere of the entire courtroom without raising his voice once. Darius noticed the change in Lawson's expression but did not respond. Instead, he looked briefly toward the high seal of justice mounted above the judge's bench. The symbol had been placed there decades earlier as a reminder that the law stood above personal pride or assumption. For a moment, the courtroom felt almost like a stage waiting for the next act of a story no one had expected to witness. Tanya leaned slightly forward in her chair, lowering her voice just enough that only Darius could hear her. She asked softly if everything was going to be all right. Darius glanced down at her and gave the smallest reassuring nod. The gesture was calm, confident, and completely unhurried. In that moment, he did not look like a man trapped in someone else's authority. He looked like someone who understood exactly how patience could turn the course of an entire room. And outside the courtroom, down the quiet hallway where courthouse offices connected one after another, the quiet ripple that had begun with a single name was already moving toward people whose arrival would soon change everything. The quiet ripple that had begun beyond the courtroom walls finally reached the door. At first, it was nothing more than the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway, measured and purposeful, the kind of footsteps that belonged to people who were not wandering or searching, but arriving exactly where they intended to be. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere remained tense yet controlled. Every person seated on the wooden benches now watching the center of the room with a level of attention that had not existed earlier that morning. Officer Brett Lawson noticed the sound before anyone else seemed to react. His eyes shifted briefly toward the heavy wooden door at the back of the courtroom, then back toward Darius Cole. Something in his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The confidence he had carried only minutes earlier had begun to show small cracks along the edges. Meanwhile, the courthouse clerk behind the bench looked toward the same door with quiet expectation. The folder she had placed on the polished surface of the bench remained unopened, but the meaning of the name inside it had already traveled further than she had anticipated. A moment later, the door opened slowly. Two men stepped inside, both dressed in dark suits that carried the unmistakable bearing of federal officials. Their movements were calm but deliberate, their eyes scanning the room before settling almost immediately on the man standing beside the defense table. The murmurs began instantly, soft at first but spreading quickly through the gallery like a sudden breeze moving across still water. People leaned toward one another again, whispering questions that none of them yet had answers for. The two men moved forward together until they reached the open aisle that led toward the front of the courtroom. One of them spoke quietly with the clerk, showing a small identification card that she examined carefully before nodding. Officer Lawson watched the exchange with a growing sense that something far larger than a simple courtroom disruption had just entered the room. His gaze shifted once more toward Darius, and for the first time uncertainty replaced the authority in his expression. Darius remained exactly as he had been before the door opened, calm and steady, as if the arrival of the two officials had only confirmed something he had already expected. One of the men approached him and spoke in a low, respectful tone that carried just far enough for the nearest spectators to hear. He addressed him not as a defendant or a visitor, but by his full name, followed by a title that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Several people in the gallery inhaled sharply. Tanya lifted her eyes toward her brother with quiet relief, as if a weight she had been carrying all morning had suddenly begun to lift. The second official turned toward the bench and placed a thin folder beside the clerk's documents. Inside were verification papers that confirmed what only a few people in the building had realized earlier. Darius Cole was not simply present in the courtroom as family support. He was a decorated service member with a record of disciplined leadership and federal-level clearance connected to the very legal review that had brought him to this courthouse in the first place. The realization moved through the room in waves. Conversation stopped. Curious stares turned into expressions of respect and disbelief. Officer Lawson felt the change more than anyone else. The room he had believed he controlled only minutes earlier now seemed to belong to something far larger than his uniform. Darius met the officer's gaze once more, his expression still calm, still composed. But the meaning behind that calm had finally become clear to everyone watching. Patience had not been weakness. It had been certainty waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now that moment had arrived. The moment the verification papers touched the polished wood of the bench, the energy inside the courtroom shifted in a way no one could ignore anymore. What had started as quiet curiosity now turned into a wave of realization moving row by row across the gallery. People who had only minutes earlier watched Darius Cole with uncertainty were now studying him with a completely different understanding. The two federal officials remained calm as they spoke briefly with the clerk, their voices low but firm, the tone of professionals accustomed to situations where clarity mattered more than volume. One of them gestured politely toward Darius as he confirmed the information contained in the documents. The words were simple, but their meaning carried weight. The man standing beside the defense table was not merely present as a concerned family member. He had arrived with a purpose connected to a broader legal review already underway beyond the walls of that courtroom. The realization spread quickly through the room. Several attorneys seated along the side benches straightened in their chairs, suddenly aware that the hearing unfolding before them might be part of something far larger than they first believed. A reporter near the back quietly opened a notebook and began writing again, sensing that the quiet story developing inside the courtroom might soon reach beyond the courthouse itself. At the defense table, Tanya Cole felt the tension leave her shoulders for the first time that morning. She looked up at her brother with relief that she tried to hide, but the emotion was impossible to conceal completely. Darius acknowledged her with a calm glance before returning his attention to the officials standing nearby. The discipline he had carried through years of service remained evident in every movement he made. There was no celebration in his expression, no visible satisfaction at the sudden shift in the room. Only the same steady composure that had been there from the beginning. Across the aisle, Officer Brett Lawson stood frozen in place longer than he realized. The officer had witnessed countless courtroom proceedings during his career, but he had never experienced a moment where the structure of authority in the room shifted so quietly, yet so completely. The assumptions he had formed earlier in the morning now felt dangerously incomplete. He looked once more toward the documents resting on the bench, then toward the federal officials speaking with the clerk, and finally back toward Darius. The calm confidence in Darius's posture no longer looked like simple patience. Now it looked like certainty that had been waiting for the right moment to appear. The first official finally turned toward the center of the room and spoke clearly enough for those nearest the front to hear. His voice carried the steady tone of someone used to briefing others in serious environments. He explained that Darius Cole had been cooperating with an ongoing federal review connected to multiple legal matters currently under evaluation. His presence in the courtroom that day had not been accidental. It had been part of a larger effort to ensure transparency and accuracy in cases connected to the proceedings scheduled for that week. The explanation did not accuse anyone directly, yet its meaning was unmistakable. The courtroom had just become part of something much larger than a routine hearing. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery again, this time filled with a mixture of surprise and respect. Several people glanced toward Officer Lawson, their expressions shifting as they reconsidered the events that had unfolded earlier. Lawson felt the weight of those glances immediately. The authority he had relied upon earlier now seemed fragile under the attention of the entire room. Meanwhile, Darius remained composed, his gaze steady as he looked briefly toward the seal of justice mounted above the bench. The symbol reflected the afternoon light, shining faintly against the wall as if reminding everyone present that the purpose of the courtroom had always been larger than any single moment of misunderstanding. The officials finished their conversation with the clerk and stepped back slightly, allowing the room to settle again. Yet the atmosphere had permanently changed. The courtroom that had once felt routine now carried the quiet awareness that truth, patience, and discipline had just reshaped the direction of an entire morning. And as the clock on the wall ticked forward toward the next phase of the hearing, every person present understood that the story unfolding in that room was far from finished. For a long moment after the officials finished speaking, no one in the courtroom moved. The silence was no longer tense or uncertain. It carried the weight of understanding. The kind of understanding that arrives slowly and then settles in a room like gravity. The fluorescent lights continued their quiet hum above the wooden benches while the afternoon sun stretched thin lines of light across the floor. Outside the courthouse windows, traffic moved along the street as if nothing extraordinary had happened inside the building. But inside that courtroom, every person present knew they had just witnessed something that would not easily be forgotten. Darius Cole stood exactly where he had been standing since the moment the room first fell silent earlier that morning. His posture remained calm, his breathing steady, his expression composed. Yet the way people looked at him now had completely changed. A few minutes earlier, he had been a stranger in a suit standing beside the defense table. Now he was someone whose presence carried the quiet authority of experience, discipline, and truth revealed at the right moment. Tanya Cole exhaled slowly beside the defense table, her hands finally relaxing around the folder she had been holding all morning. She looked at her brother again, and for the first time since entering the courtroom her shoulders lowered with visible relief. Darius returned the glance with a calm nod, the same reassuring gesture he had used earlier. Nothing dramatic, nothing unnecessary, just quiet confirmation that everything had unfolded exactly as it needed to. Across the room, Officer Brett Lawson stood near the aisle, his earlier confidence replaced by something far more complicated. The room he had believed he controlled only an hour earlier now felt completely different. The assumptions he had made in a few seconds had been overturned by patience, by documentation, and by the quiet arrival of truth that did not need to shout in order to be heard. Lawson looked once more toward the bench where the documents rested, then toward the two officials standing calmly near the clerk. Finally, his gaze returned to Darius. For the first time that morning, the officer seemed to fully understand the meaning behind the words he had heard earlier. The worst mistake of your career had not been a threat. It had been a statement of reality waiting for its moment to unfold. In the gallery, several observers continued whispering quietly, the energy in their voices now carrying respect rather than suspicion. A reporter near the back closed his notebook slowly, clearly aware that the story unfolding in the courtroom was not one of chaos or confrontation, but something far more powerful. It was a story about patience meeting assumption and allowing truth to speak for itself. The federal officials exchanged a final word with the clerk before stepping slightly to the side, allowing the normal rhythm of the courtroom to resume. Yet even as the routine preparations for the hearing continued, the atmosphere remained changed. People moved with a little more awareness. Conversations carried a little more thoughtfulness. The seal of justice mounted above the bench seemed to watch over the room with renewed meaning. Darius glanced once more toward that symbol before turning his attention back to his sister and the legal process that had brought them there in the first place. He had not come to the courthouse to prove a point or win an argument. He had come to stand beside family and ensure that the truth surrounding the case received the fairness it deserved. The rest of the story had simply unfolded because patience allowed it to. As the clock on the wall advanced toward the beginning of the hearing, the lesson of the morning lingered quietly in the minds of everyone present. Authority without understanding could move quickly, but truth moved with